Okay, when we look at question 2, we know we focus on settlement geography and we have a look at economic geography. Okay, when we're going to look at question 1, we mainly focus on rural and urban settlements. Okay, the paper that we're discussing is obviously last year's November 2022 final exam. And like I've mentioned, question 1 is going to focus on settlement geography. Now, if you look at our first question, we focus on rural settlements and we focus on urban settlements. Now, question 1.1, we need to choose the correct answer. It's multiple choice, and let's see what's being asked. Now, 1.1.1, rural settlements are associated with primary activities. Remember, rural settlements focus on farming, fishing, forestry, and mining. FFFM. Okay, where our urban settlements focus on secondary and tertiary activities. Okay, and quaternary activities also with urban settlements. When we look at question 1.1.2, a dispersed settlement pattern develops when there is. Okay, now we can distinguish between two patterns in rural settlements: dispersed settlements as well as nucleated settlements. Dispersed is when the people live very far from one another. Nucleated when they're all clustered together. Okay. Simple reason, it might be because of different regions. It might be when they're nucleated together, it might be because there's a dry point settlement or a wet point settlement, which we will discuss a little bit later. Dispersed settlements, maybe because of abundance of fertile soil, maybe because of it's a flat gradient, flat area. Okay, and there's enough water in that specific area. So if we have a look at question 1.1.2, one dominant water source, that will be incorrect. Abundance of water, like I've mentioned, that will be the correct answer. A narrow river or valley, that will cause the settlement to be nucleated. Communal ownership of land will also be nucleated because the people farm together. They own the piece of land together. So the correct answer for 1.1.2 will be B. 1.1.3, an advantage of rural nucleated settlements. Okay, like we just mentioned, it might be like communal ownership of land. It might be because it's in a narrow river valley. There's not enough space, so the people are closer together. And let's quickly have a look, discuss wet point and dry point settlements. Okay, what's a dry point settlement? The best way to explain it to you is you want to stay dry. Okay, so the people are at a high-lying area because they might be prone for floods. When we look at a wet point settlement, it might mean there's not a lot of water. The water is scarce, so the people cluster around a water resource. Now, if we quickly have a look at question 1.1.3, advantage of a rural nucleated settlement: sharing of farm equipment, large commercial plots of land, making independent decisions, making large profits. Now, first and foremost, immediately, I know B, C, and D will be incorrect. Sharing of farming equipment goes hand in hand with this, communal ownership of land. So a bunch of people can share their farming equipment. When we look at commercial farms, they are mainly usually dispersed, right? Because the purpose for big commercial farms is to make a profit. And they are usually privately owned. So these people make their decisions by themselves. So B, C, and D goes hand in hand usually with dispersed rural settlements. Whereas farm equipment being shared is usually communal. Okay, so the correct answer for 1.1.3 will be A. 1.1.4, A is the location of a settlement in relation to the situation. That's the correct answer over there. The site is chosen for a specific reason because there's fertile soil, there's water, there's flat land. But if we look at the surrounding area, that's the situation. Okay, so the correct answer for 1.1.4 will be D. We've just mentioned this a couple of seconds earlier. 1.1.5, a dry point settlement is located far from water, far from a thread of water, or near because it's a threat or because it's scarce. And the correct answer over there will be B. Like I've mentioned, keep in mind, think of it, you want to stay dry. So you're far from the water because it might be a threat, especially during seasonal rainfall when the water levels increases in the river and the floodplain is getting flooded. So the correct answer for 1.1.5, because it's a dry point settlement, they will be far from the water because it might be a threat to them and the community. 1.1.6 gives us a sketch, and the questions around on the shape of the settlement. Now, as you can see immediately, right, the keys that's being used, these indicates the roads, and then we have buildings in each of these sections. Now, immediately, the shape will be crossroads, right, as you can see, because there's two roads crossing each other, or it might be major transport routes crossing each other. It might be a railway line and a road. In this case, it's a road. So the correct answer will be C, crossroads. If you look at question 1.1.7, the circular shape of the settlement below is influenced by, definitely, as you can see, the settlement is in a circular shape. Now let's just quickly revise. We can also call this a wet point settlement. Okay, just adding to it, because water is scarce, as you can see, the buildings are situated next to the water source, and that's the lake. So the correct answer for 1.1.7 will be A. If we quickly have a look at question 1.1.8, the following physical factors determine the site of the settlement. Now we discussed this. Right, the accessibility to transport, the distance to the market, relief, and fertile soil. Now, I've mentioned this also a couple of seconds ago. When we look at the site, we need to look at the soil fertility, right? We need to go and look at the topography, okay? When we look at the situation, that's the accessibility of roads around us. So immediately, we can throw this one out of the picture. Second, the distance to the market, also we can leave that one out. So the correct answer will be relief and fertile soil, right? And that will be, the correct answer will be D. Okay, it's question 1.1, done and dusted. Now question 1.2, once again, is short answer questions. Please, grade 12, very important, your concepts, okay, when we're looking at these short answer questions. In this case, question 1.2 focus on the concept and the definition, okay, right, and we just need to match column A with column B. In this case, if you look at column A, question 1.2.1, the first one, if you look at the concept, process whereby increasing percentage of the country's population is concentrated in an urban area, and the correct answer will be urbanization. If we look at question 1.2.2, the increase in the number of people living in urban areas, that's urban growth. So the people has already lived in the urban areas, but the population is increasing. So that's urban growth taking place. 1.2.3, process where people move from urban areas into surrounding rural areas, that's counter urbanization. Okay, so obviously we've seen it, you know, it's a topic that we always discuss. It's the rural-urban migration. It's the people moving from rural areas to urban areas. Why? Because of push and pull factors. Better job opportunities, better healthcare facilities, better schooling, better housing. Okay, but as we've seen in the last couple of years, especially with the advanced technology, people are having Zoom meetings, team meetings. We see counter-urbanization taking place. People actually moving away from urban areas to go and stay in rural areas because with today's technology, it makes it much more easier. Okay, and it's cheaper in rural areas, and some people might see it as a better quality of life in rural areas. Let's just quickly look at question 1.2.4. The increase in actual physical size of the urban area. And the correct area over there answer will be urban expansion. So we're talking about the physical landscape, the surface area of the urban area, increasing in size because of urban growth, and that's urban expansion taking place. Urban hierarchy, if you look at the second option, that's incorrect. That's the classification according to urban settlements from small to big. Now question 1.2.5, the unplanned spread of urban areas. That answer is also Y, is urban sprawl. Now, this happens when there's rapid movement of people from rural to urban areas. So it's not planned new suburbs, right? So the urban area is physically getting bigger, but it's unplanned, and that's known as urban sprawl. So 1.2.5, the correct answer is Y. 1.2.6, the decreasing number of people living in rural areas. The correct answer is there, rural depopulation. Now, rural depopulation is a consequence. The consequence for rural depopulation is rural urban migration. Once again, like I've mentioned earlier, it's because of the pull and push factors that we experienced. Okay, pull factors, better employment opportunities, better healthcare, better services. What's the push factors? Unemployment, lack of services, okay, lack of schooling, for example. Please, you need to be able to differentiate between the push and pull factors as well. And lastly, 1.2.7, there's the arrangement of settlements in the area from the smallest and largest. And I've explained it when we did question 1.2.4, and that's your hierarchy. Okay. Now that's the short answer questions. Let's see what follows. Okay, question 1.3. They're giving us some sources below, a case study on land reform. Now let's just quickly look at key components of this case study. As you can see, South Africa currently faces a problem of the process of land reform. Okay, now they've mentioned it happens too slowly, right? And it has become economically inactive. So it's not happening fast enough, and we're losing money. Now, obviously, we look at the conflicting views, right, the different views. Now, keep in mind, we had apartheid policies. If you look at the back of the history of South Africa, so injustices was done. So we need to go and have a look what the future is going to hold for the land reform in South Africa, and how can it be accelerated? How can we take this movement to take place faster so that there can be equal outcomes? So that means that both parties can be happy. Once the land's been taken or distributed to someone else, that both parties are happy, right? And most importantly, whose interest will be served. Now you need to keep in mind the country's interest is probably the most important, because let's say, for instance, we take a well-equipped commercial farm that made profit. Okay, that still needs to continue making profit, adding to the GDP of the country. Okay, if you look at our next paragraph, if you look at the South African Agricultural Congress, okay, there's a panel who discuss on the future of land reform that's agreed upon, right? Once again, when there's an agreement taking place, there's going to be negotiations, and there needs to be compromises. Okay. Now, once again, if you look at the 3 pillars of land reform, there's the redistribution, tenure, and restitution of the land. Okay. And if you look at the last paragraph over here, well-managed land reform can create assets for the poor, stabilize relationships, and promote development. That's the key of the land reform process. Okay. Economic growth, development, and to reduce poverty, okay, and food insecurity. Vitally important. That's the purpose of the land reform. Okay, as you can see, we want to try and remove poverty from communities And when this land reform does take place, the last thing we want to do is to weaken the economy. We still need to add to the GDP. Now, if you look at it, poorly managed farms, for instance, right, well managed, there's an agreement taking place, right, it's not going to be subsistence farming taking place, it's going to be commercial farming taking place, right, commercial farming is there to make a profit. In this case, we can add to the GDP. With commercial farming, it creates employment opportunities and it can create exporting of products as well, so we can earn foreign income, vitally important for the country. But most importantly, probably, if you look at farming, provide food security, employment opportunities. As we can see, well managed, there's a good relationship and everyone agreed on the process. Now, if you look at the first question, right, what is land reform? It's a policy to bring equal distribution and access to land. Okay, that's the definition of land reform. According to the extract, what is the benefit of a well-managed land reform? Okay, once again, most importantly, create assets for the poor, it promotes development. And we can also mention, if there's development taking place, it creates jobs. Okay. Question 1.3.3. Why is land restitution considered a challenge? If you look at it, according to our case study, funding and budgets, it's expensive because there's lawyers involved, and that's my second point. There needs to be legal arrangements so both parties can be happy. Now, how does B illustrate the successful process of land restitution? Now, obviously, we can see it if we go back to diagram B. First and foremost, there's a handshake taking place. So it means both parties are happy. Okay. So we can mention what you've seen in the image. There's a handshake. Now, as we know, when we look at handshakes, it means no one is fighting. And it was a peaceful agreement, what you see in that image. Now, obviously, we looked at it in the case study as well, which factors have caused the process of land reform to advance very slowly. Now, if you look at that, because of poverty, there's legal processes in place that's expensive. So we can say it's costly. And unfortunately, the government won't be able to provide funding, lacks funding. And it's expensive to train farmers. So any one of those you can use for that answer. Now, if you look at the social benefits of a well-managed reform for people living in rural areas. Social benefits, obviously, it's going to improve people's quality of life and standard of living. It's going to have a major impact on the surrounding community. Okay. First and foremost, it creates employment opportunities. Now, it provides food security. Okay, poverty will decrease because people are employed. Okay, and overall of quality of life will improve. Okay, our next question, we got a graph showing us the land value of an urban area, and the example that was given is from Johannesburg. Okay, we got the Central Business District, also known the abbreviation of the CBD. Okay, and as you can see, the land value low and high. Okay, now immediately what can we see? Where's the highest land value? At the CBD, there where A is situated. The zone of decay or the transition zone is situated at B. Then we have C, high income residential areas over there. And lastly, outlying business districts, for instance, Sandton is the example, situated on the outskirts. If you just quickly have a look at the information that's been given to us, the CBD of Johannesburg has experienced a decline in economic investment over the past 20 years. Okay, so there's a decline. Problems such as crime, inefficient public transport, decay, decreased accessibility is the main problems that's being experienced. Just think of the congestion that we experience in Johannesburg CBD. Okay, so we identify the problems. So what has happened over the years? These factors force businesses to relocate to outlying business districts. Okay, so there's Johannesburg CBD. I'm just going to show it. So businesses relocate, and I'm going to use Sandton as the example. Okay, giving rise to commercial decentralization. In spite of this, the land values remain high in the CBD. The transition zone is generally dilapidated, but maintains high land values. Now, if you look at the transition zone, it's the zone right next to the CBD. The reason why there's still high land values. Now, if you look at the zone of transition, zone of decay, right, it's a bunch of mixed functions, right? It's commercial and it's residential in between. But the reason why the value is still very high because it's closest situated to the CBD. Now, if we go back to the history of the Central Business District, if you look at Johannesburg, for example, the tallest buildings, the skyscrapers, all of them are situated in the CBD because it was cheaper to build in an upward direction than going sideways. And that's the reason why we have these tall skyscrapers, because it was expensive if you look at the stands in the CBD. Now let's just quickly have a look at the questions being asked regarding this. Okay, here we can see the CBD of Johannesburg. There's the Carlton Centre. State two characteristics of the Johannesburg CBD that's evident in this photograph. Immediately we can see the skyscrapers, the tall buildings. Okay, and we can see it's densely built. Okay, many buildings in a small area. Okay, high density buildings. And we have very tall buildings. Okay, which land use zone is the highest land value is indicated in the graph. So on the graph, it still shows us that the CBD still has the highest land values, as you can see. You can see that the OBD, the land value is quite high as well. So the CBD. If you look at question 1.4.4, why is the transition zone generally dilapidated despite the high land values? So I just mentioned it to you because it's closest to the CBD in case the CBD expands. And the homeowners can still get high prices. Question 1.4.5. Why is the outlying business district attractive for the relocation of businesses? Now, let's just identify the problems again being experienced in our CBDs that was mentioned in this case study. Crime, inefficient public transport, decaying buildings, and decreased accessibility. So this is immediately just the opposite why people want to decentralize their businesses, why they want to move to a place like Sandton, outlying business districts, right? First and foremost, because it's more accessible. I can mention that. Less crime. Okay, cheaper rent, because we've seen on the graph that the CBD is still the most expensive in land value. Okay, we can also mention less pollution, less congestion, and especially people going to work, more parking. So just make overall life just so much easier. Okay. 1.5, if we quickly have a look at the extract over here, like I've mentioned, when we focus on settlement geography, we focus on urban, rural, and informal settlements. Now, just before I continue, looking at the case study that's been provided, what's an informal settlement? It's a settlement that lacks basic needs and services. Okay, very important. Please don't get confused when we're going to look at our next question, the difference between the informal sector and an informal settlement. So we focus on the informal settlement over here. Okay, as we can see, there's floods causing destruction in informal settlements, right, in eThekwini and the surrounding areas. As you can see, how can we identify the informal settlements? We just look at the housing structure. We also know them as shacks in South Africa. It's material that's being used, any type of material. It's not very safe, right? And as you can see, with flooding, not a very strong infrastructure, right? Families will get displaced, right? In the informal settlement, it creates more housing problems that they already face. Now, we see an increase in the size of informal settlements because of rural-urban migration, because of rapid urbanization. And unfortunately, many places are getting overcrowded, so the people had to go and settle in informal settlements. Now, if you look at it, the reason for it is the rapid urbanization and failure from government to deliver proper housing. Okay, as you can see, proper housing, formal housing, the unavailability of suitable land for the housing, as you can see, and eventually this is a direct consequence of disasters like flooding. Now, this is especially happening close to Johannesburg and Alexandra, next to the Yixkay River, especially during summer. Okay. Now, a scary statistic that's being mentioned over here, the result is that a quarter of South Africa's urban population lives in informal settlements. Okay, and once again, they are prone to disasters like this. Now, like I've mentioned, if you look at the concept of an informal settlement, they lack basic amenities and infrastructure, like proper roads and stormwater drainage systems, even sanitation, clinics, etc. Okay. If we look at the questions that's being asked, if we look at it, an informal settlement that lacks basic needs and services. Quote a reason from the extract for the increase in number of informal settlements in eThekwini. Okay, we looked at that. The reason is because of the rapid urbanization taking place. And another reason is government failing to provide formal housing. Question 1.5.3, why are informal settlements in eThekwini at risk of flooding? Because they are situated close to the water, next to the rivers, usually building inside the floodplain. So the low-lying areas is the floodplain. And also mentioned, there's very poor drainage or storm water systems. Like I've mentioned, lack of infrastructure. 1.5.4, how would the lack of proper roads negatively impact on emergency services? Once again, we're dealing with lack of infrastructure such as proper roads, tar road surfaces. Okay, how will it react on emergency services to get to people who's in an emergency situation, like times of disaster and floods? So first of all, it will take much longer to reach residents in distress. And our last question on this topic of informal settlements, in a paragraph of 8 lines, suggests measures to prevent flood-related disasters in informal settlements. Okay. First and foremost, what we can do is to relocate the people away from floodplains. Relocate the settlements from low-lying areas prone for flooding okay. Can provide the people with better building material. Instead of wood and steel, we can use bricks. So I just want to write there, better building material. Once again, the government can provide housing, better housing, provide better infrastructure. That includes roads, as well as drainage systems like stormwater drainage systems. And especially for the people, better access to emergency services. Okay.